Bush Radio. Bush Radio.
Your real talk radio.
Daganan kilo bejaning kom lo moham lo di bejamaso sanalom muasa benge kaputo
State Affairs.
State Affairs with Edmund Obilo.
Professor Eghosa Osaghae, it's good to have you on State Affairs.
Thank you.
Before we delve into your paper, A State of Our Own, I want to know what it feels like being a scholar, being a lecturer, and being a man constantly in search of knowledge.
It's something about self-motivation, and therefore something that is tied to some form of self-fulfillment. So there is a zeal, there's a motivation to contribute to knowledge production and to scholarship. That is a motivation, and that is what ties scholarship, teaching, and all of the caps that one is able to wear at the same time.
In spite of this level of scholarship, some would say Africa has not really used knowledge for development.
Well, Africa has knowledge that is submerged. Africa has knowledge that is put to the sidelines. Africa has knowledge that is at the margins. And that is the whole point about, understanding the nature of knowledge production and the whole terrain of how knowledge is used. For historical and structural reasons, the world, is ruled by a colonization of ideas, of knowledge, colonization of scholarship that mainstreams, colonial, by which I mean Western European knowledge forms as the universal knowledge forms. And all other forms of knowledge are expected to key into this kind of universe of, if you like, some very hegemonic knowledge structure. So what this means is, if you are not mainstream, as we say in the social sciences, you are analyzed by analogy. You are analyzed as some kind of appendage, to a knowledge form. So that means that the supposedly superior forms of knowledge are the ones that come from the global north. By the global north, again, I mean Western Europe and, Western civilization. That has generalized its form of knowledge, dating back to the Enlightenment period, and imposed that form of knowledge more or less on the rest of the world. So the rest of the world then is reduced to some kind of tyranny of, imported paradigms. Let me put these things in very clear perspective. Today, we have discussions of problems of governance, problems of statehood, problems of diplomacy and international relations, problems of development. But ask for 1 minute, what language are we speaking when we discuss these things? We are speaking a language that has been devised and has been, diffused all over the world, by the so-called hegemonic centers of global capital. So they have given us narratives and definitions of concepts that sometimes don't quite fit our circumstances, but we are forced to use them. For instance, everyone now uses state failure without knowing what it means. Corruption is a byline for what is African. So the only way to typify the African condition is to say, dismiss it as it's all corruption. And that's those forms of reductionism, by which I mean reducing all complex explanations to just one single variable. Those things are problematic.
And if we talk about emerging economies in Asia, they have taken off despite going through similar experiences with many African states. How do you explain that?
Well, it's very easy to explain. You have not had an even extent of colonization and colonialism. Some countries, some systems have been completely swept apart by colonial forces. Others have, managed to remain resilient, and therefore they have, if you like, some filters for accepting and for rejecting the kinds of things that are not compatible or that contradict what they do. China, for instance, has retained, a very strong non-Western resilience. And China has been so ideologically driven along those lines, has a very rich past. Or you want to take another example, say the two Koreas, North and South Korea. Or you take Thailand, or you take Taiwan, or you take India, and the other so-called Asian tigers, or Japan, even for that matter. Again, Japan has become more or less Western in its orientation and in its ideological affiliations. Japan is now more or less, as an industrial country. Japan has joined the ranks of Western civilization. China has, India has, Korea has. Now, what is common to all of these things is, of course, the industrial base. The industrial base itself is not Western. It's not a Western monopoly. In terms of industrial revolution, Western Europe found itself, ahead of several other parts of the world, but it didn't have a monopoly of industrialization. Now you have asked the question, why is Africa different? Why is Africa not able to do what these other countries have done? I'm sure you're beginning to find part of the answer in the fact that all of these states, the countries that are African countries, are so artificial that the greatest problem they have is to even forge, some notion, some modicum of statehood as something that is commonly owned and that therefore can hold as a center for generating ideas, for industrializing, and for doing the kinds of things that the Chinas, the Japans, the Indias, and all these other countries have been able to do. So it is the artificiality that we have not been able to deal with, in the context of the colonized states in Africa, that must rank as one of the biggest impediments that we've had so far. Let me go through what I have said. When you have an ancient civilization, when you have some other civilization that is non-Western but is resilient, is rooted so strongly in not just culture but also forms of what you may now call indigenous technology, those kinds of societies are likely to not only adapt quickly to the changing climes and demands of global capitalism, but they have a resilience that comes from the ability, the capacity to sift through the forces of globalization in such a manner that they can, strengthen the ones that are positive while rejecting, where it is possible, the ones that are not positive. Unfortunately, most countries in Africa don't have that filter. They don't have the lenses. They don't have the resilience. They don't have the capacity, to do that. If you look all through Africa, if we had proper states, then, you can have a comparable basis for the kind of thing that you are expecting or saying. We don't have proper states.
Let's look closely at your paper, A State of Our Own. By the end of the first decade of the post-independence era, more than 30 wars had been fought in Africa, with millions of deaths. And in your work, you said that the problems of war, terrorism, corruption, and poverty in Africa are functions of the contested ownership of the state. Can you break this down?
Again, just to take the bearings from, my last responses. You have a state that is not commonly owned. You have a state whose constituents were forcibly incorporated and, for the most part, without any determination of where they actually would want to be. You have a state that has colonial origins and therefore has violent incorporation at its own foundation. This state has put together, different people, different groups, and the state has remained a repressive machine, a violent machine that depends largely on only one understanding of self-determination, which independence simply meant self-determination of that one state. So what we call independence was actually some kind of, way of exercising the right to self-determination. Now, once you have a superimposition of the right to self-determination as a state right, that almost by definition means that the other contesting rights to self-determination become not so legitimate. And yet this is where we are, because independence, didn't mean that the question of the ownership of the state had been resolved. So if you like, in one word, all that, we have seen in many African states is a contested legitimacy of the state, meaning that many people don't agree at the most extreme that this is the kind of state we want to belong to. But even if, by force of colonial circumstances, we now find ourselves in these states, we want a place of our own. We want to be able to agree together with the other constituents on the kind of state that we want. Now, this is why, if you read that case, we have had in the scholarship on African democracy and African development the concept of the second independence. The first independence definitely has failed because it has not been able to put the states together. That is why, we have had, over-centralization. We've had very autocratic and authoritarian regimes. We've had, repression, of difference. We've had state capture that reinforces exclusivity and exclusionary rulership. What, those forms of contestation amount to is basically saying we need to renegotiate the foundations and the basis for staying together in this state. Because if we cannot create, some kind of common ground for the states that we have, the states simply cannot work. I mean, this is the point. So when we have colonial inheritances that we now need to put together in the sense of second independence, where people's rights to self-determination would now matter. And, Ethiopia has shown one of the ways that can be done. Ethiopia has said that all of its, states in its federation reserve the right to self-determination. And the fact that they enjoy autonomy in a federal system means that you can have, the space for exercising your right to self-determination.
So are you saying here that self-determination is all about autonomy? Does it also include secession?
Self-determination. Look at the word, the meaning of the word. Self-determination simply means making your own choice over where you want to be, over who you want to be, over how you want to be governed. Now, so when the Americans say, for instance, there can be no taxation without representation, they are simply saying that's self-determination. Self-determination, in its extreme, characterization, would probably encompass secession. But that is not the point. Self-determination is not incompatible with statehood. I mean, that's basically the point. Especially for countries where people have not had the platform, they've not had the opportunity, they've not had the space to exercise the free choice of, how they want to belong. Now, see, if you are in Ibadan, you live in, a part of Ibadan called Yemetu. Yemetu is not an artificial structure. Yemetu has its historical antecedents, and therefore Yemetu has a sense of a community, and Yemetu can, work as an autonomous, a relatively autonomous community, and can serve as, a platform of effective local governance that would have some forms of self-governance. That is self-determination. Let's put it like this. The late Ukbabi Asika, who was administrator of the East Central State, has put the point I'm trying to make in very bold relief. He, as the administrator of the East Central State, said to the citizens of Nigeria at the time, using Igbo categories, he said, look, for us as Nigerians, the Igbos say, there are two kinds of realms, two kinds of societies, two kinds of communities. The one is what they call the Olu-Oyibo. That is a reference to the state as we know it. Then there is Olu-Obodo. That is our community. Now, he said, when it comes to Olu-Obodo, which is our community, you make all the sacrifices, you emphasize duty over right. You are ready to make all the sacrifices so that Olu-Obodo, our community, can survive, can develop, can make progress. But when it comes to Olu-Oyibo, which is the state, the larger state, the Nigerian state, the easiest way to get to that state is to say it has no father, it has no mother. So the kinds of things that you would defend and protect and be ready to die for, in your community, you are not able to translate to the larger Nigerian state. That is the kind of contradiction that I'm talking about. It is how to transfer the loyalties and senses of belongingness and defense that you have for Olu Obodo, which is our community, to the Olu Oyibo, which is now possible only when you own the state. And people are saying, how do we own the state? We can only own the state when we find space for ourselves in a manner that we have negotiated and bargained with other people. Now, in using these very concrete terms, I'm not talking in terms of what MOSOP or IPOP or all of those groups are saying. No. Every group has a right to, insist on what it wants, but I'm using the building blocks. That's why I'm going to the most organic of the communities. And it is these organic communities that become then the building blocks for building a proper civil society. It's a civil society, that is then able to knock in shape the kind of state that we want. So if Olu Obodo becomes Olu Oyibo, you will not have the kind of corruption that you're getting in the state, because then everyone says this is the only state that we have. We will defend it and protect it. But what you have right now is that what is not permissible in our community, because we have strong moral values, are permissible in the larger community called the state, because that one has no father, it has no mother. So people can go and steal from that state, and they would be, protected by the community. I mean, when we talk about, creating states and renegotiating and rebargaining, it's not the most extreme form of, the kinds of, insistences on self-determination in the sense of secession. No, that's not what we're saying. It's for regular communities, organic communities that want to have a state that they can all have a sense of belonging in. And, sense of belonging doesn't mean having federal appointments. It doesn't mean having central government representation. It simply means begin with us. Let us be able to manage what we have. Let us have some portion of the resources that are available to us. I'll give you an example. Here in South Africa, there is the rooibos tea. Rooibos tea is some kind of special tea. It's grown by the Khoisan peoples, and it comes from the rooibos plant, which is only found, in the area. Over the ages, the Khoisan peoples have added value to the Khoisan plant, and they have, a recipe, if you like, some technical ability to make this rooibos tea into a special form of herbal tea. And over the years, the Khoisan people, they are an absolute minority. They've been saying this is our greatest resource. I mean, South Africa as a country gets a lot of benefits, from the commercialization of rooibos tea. But they are saying we who own, the original formula for rooibos, we have been neglected and nothing has come to us. And last year, the government finally said, one, the intellectual property belongs to you, and two, now you are entitled to a percentage of every rooibos tea that is produced. That gives the Khoisan people a space, not in central government, but a space to enjoy the fruits of their labor. That's the kind of ownership that I'm talking about.
So what we have in the Niger Delta at the moment, the question of militancy, is as a result of the contested ownership of the state.
Absolutely. Because, you see, in negotiating the terms of, accommodation and coexistence, the Niger Delta people ought to have a say. And that say simply means you have a share in what you get. There's 13%, but the question is that kind of what you call derivation? Is that is that the best you can offer to them? Now, we must learn from what the other countries in the world are doing and how they are able to secure some forms of accommodation, some forms of equity and justice. What is happening to the Basque region in Spain, for instance, what is happening to Quebec in Canada, what is happening even to the minorities in China. What do people want? What are they mobilizing for? Is to have a better form of equitable accommodation within the state itself. I mean, and if you take the example of what is going on in the United States, these are all struggles for representation, for voice, for belonging, and so on. These things need to be worked out. And sometimes, and that's my whole point, the things don't take any programmed form. It's not like you have social engineering where you then say, this is what must happen and so on. They can be spontaneous. They can be, they can come in several forms, even in elections and so on. But the people must be allowed to express. We must give vent to what people want to say, and we should be able to re-bargain or renegotiate continuously on those bases.
You are of the view that the crisis of contemporary African states is the struggle between the forces of colonialism and decolonization. How do you relate these to the actions of bandits in the Middle Belt of Nigeria?
Well, first, criminality and crime. These are given. They are known. They continue to exist. Sometimes they become weapons. Sometimes they become strategies for articulating and expressing grievances. When they take on such, manifestly political forms, then they become really problematic. Now, how do you separate crime from political grievance or social grievance or economic grievance or from people who feel marginalized and therefore they don't have a sense of belonging? Now, all of these issues have been dealt with in the context of terrorism in the Northeast, for instance. How you can relate, forms of what you call banditry, the whole industry of kidnapping, of, robberies, how you can relate those things to, underlying social forces. The fact that there is so much deprivation, relative deprivation. The fact that there is, so much poverty. The fact that, there is no access, there are no opportunities, and people find that, they have to survive. And therefore, in the event that there's so much dysfunctionality on the governmental front, these things become attractive, platforms for getting away with the kinds of articulations that people want to have. So what I'm saying is banditry as crime and criminality, banditry as some kind of manifestation of an underlying social and economic dysfunctionality. So banditry cannot be approached like terrorism, in only one way. It's a complex whole, because we need to understand who these bandits are, what, are the driving forces, what are the triggers for banditry. And, it's something we need to study. What do they want? It's like asking, what do robbers want? Where are they coming from? And my point is, except and until you're able to address these kinds of, the dynamics of these social forces and the economic, situations, we'll at best only be speculating on what we think. And I don't think that criminals should be demonized. I mean, we know enough, for instance, now to see that, in many parts of the world, one's color then becomes a representation for criminality. So when people see that there are black people in predominantly white neighborhoods, criminals have come around. But that coloration is actually a statement of gross injustice, because the fact that we are able to see people and we associate them with those kinds of problems just means that we ourselves don't have an understanding of the kinds of issues we are dealing with. So I am not saying we should excuse banditry or bandits. I'm not saying we should excuse terrorists or robbers or whatever. But the challenge is we need to get to terms with what exactly these guys are saying and where they are coming from. And until we address those underlying issues, we're not going to be able to deal with those problems.
Professor Osaghae, who should be asking the question and who should provide the answers?
Radio. Oh, wow.